1968. The people of Saigon in South Vietnam were celebrating their New Year festival called Tet. In the whole of this long war, it was the Tet Offensive of 1968 that was the pivotal moment. Fought here in the streets of Vietnam, the Tet Offensive was one of the most decisive battles of the 20th century. Since 1965, the Americans had been fighting the communist regime in North Vietnam. The West was gripped by a fear of communism, devouring country after country. And the Americans believed that if they didn't make a decisive stand in Vietnam, the whole of Southeast Asia would fall.
By 1967, hundreds of thousands of American troops had poured into South Vietnam. Many were stationed in remote areas like this hillside called Con Thien. Con Thien was at the sharp end of the war in Vietnam. The fight against the communists had become so fierce that the Marines based here called it the meat grinder.
The fire base here at Con Thien was in the front line of America's war against communism, to prevent the communist North taking over the South. Con Thien was one of a chain of US artillery bases just south of the border. Here's the base right here. And here's the border, with a kind of no man's land either side of it, called the demilitarized zone. The demilitarized zone literally cut Vietnam in half. Up here, communist North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union and China. And leading it, in its capital Hanoi, the lifelong communist and ardent nationalist Ho Chi Minh. Known as Uncle Ho to his followers, Ho Chi Minh had trained and equipped an army of 500,000 North Vietnamese soldiers. Ho had successfully driven out the French colonial government in 1954, and now he was resolved to push out the Americans and reunite Vietnam under communism. The Americans were led by General William Westmoreland. With a clutch of medals from World War II and Korea, Westmoreland now led an American force of 500,000 troops in support of some 800,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. But the challenge faced by General Westmoreland and his men was all the greater because they didn't just have one enemy, they had two.
The Southern Communist rebels called themselves the National Liberation Front, but history remembers them by the name the Americans used, the Viet Cong, or VC.
They were a huge problem for the US troops. With no uniforms to distinguish them from the other villagers in South Vietnam, it was very difficult to tell who was friend and who was foe.
You VC? Yeah, you Viet Cong, huh? You Viet Cong. You Viet Cong. You Viet Cong.
But the Viet Cong's ability to blend in was not their only advantage. They were also supplied by their powerful ally and effective controller in the north, Ho Chi Minh. He sent North Vietnamese fighters, arms and equipment down the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of unpaved roads and paths stretching hundreds of miles down the length of Vietnam. It was largely concealed in the jungle, just across the border, in supposedly neutral countries next door.
I traveled south down the Ho Chi Minh Trail twice. We literally had to hack or crawl our way through the jungle. Some people would carry up to 80 kilos on their shoulders. There were even some hill tribes people who would carry up to 90 kilos, which for the women was more than their own body weight.
The Ho Chi Minh Trail was vital to the communist war effort. And the weapon the United States deployed against it was the might of its air power. Some of the bombing targets were strategic points in North Vietnam: railways, bridges, factories, and so on. Another target for the bombers, including giant B-52s, was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Americans hoped their bombing would cut off the lifeblood of the rebels in the south. Just one of these B-52s could drop over 100 bombs and devastate an area a mile long by a quarter of a mile wide. In South Vietnam, the bombers would act on intelligence reports and try to hit Viet Cong strongholds. High explosive bombs and napalm, an extremely flammable liquid, caused terrible destruction. And much of the countryside, on which so many depended, was laid to waste.
These bombs may have been hitting their targets, but they weren't doing much to win over the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people. Often, the targets were in or near populated villages, so inevitably, civilians were killed.
It also wasn't really a very good way of rooting out the communists. To do that, there was really no alternative but to go in on foot.
The South Vietnamese army and the Americans spent days patrolling the countryside, trying to hunt down the Viet Cong and looking for telltale signs that might indicate a Viet Cong presence. But they weren't just fighting an enemy that was scarcely visible, they were fighting the conditions too. The patrols were not made any easier by the scorching temperatures and the weight of the kit the American troops often had to carry with them.
I've been walking for a while now, and the first thing you notice obviously is the heat. It's about high 30 centigrade, probably just a bit over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And the guys, the Americans, arrived in Vietnam, probably my age, probably a bit less, and most of them have probably never seen a country like this, never seen a climate like this, and I think that would have taken a lot of getting used to. It's sure difficult for me, but you know, the main thing, of course, which I don't have to worry about is that they were doing these patrols, they were carrying all this kit, and there was people trying to kill them. They wouldn't be getting any support, so they would have to eat, drink, apply medicines, and fight with just what they were carrying. Of course, this wasn't really the case for the Viet Cong. They could afford to travel a lot lighter because they had supply dumps in friendly villages. So often they were just carrying their weapon, the AK-47, a bag of rice and maybe a mosquito net or a tarp.
These patrols could be fatal, and many of the troops thought them pointless anyway. The enemy was just too slippery, too elusive. He wouldn't come out and fight the kind of set-piece battle the Americans had been trained and equipped for.
During 1967, Ho Chi Minh had become increasingly concerned. His North Vietnamese army, the NVA, had suffered heavy losses, and victory still wasn't in sight. So he turned to his defense minister, General Vo Nguyen Giap, for a solution. The plan Giap came up with was a huge gamble. The aim? To smash the South Vietnamese government and drive the Americans out once and for all. By December 1967, American intelligence knew that something big was brewing. They'd received reports of significant activity on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and then of a striking build-up of North Vietnamese troops near the American base of Khe Sanh, just south of the border. The communist enemy had suddenly become very visible. It seemed that at long last President Johnson was to get the pitched battle he'd been waiting for. And the battlefield was to be Khe Sanh. The American base of Khe Sanh was situated in an isolated, hilly corner of South Vietnam, just a few miles from the border with Laos. There's nothing left of the base today, but in January 1968, this base was home to thousands of American and South Vietnamese troops. Khe Sanh is the westernmost American stronghold near the demilitarized zone, and has been built to stop enemy infiltration from the north and disrupt supplies on the Ho Chi Minh Trail along here. Here is Khe Sanh, and this is how it was laid out. Over 6,000 Marines and South Vietnamese troops were housed in one heavily fortified combat base, built around an airstrip. Surrounding the combat base were hills, fortified with bunkers, dugouts and gun emplacements. By mid-January 1968, two whole North Vietnamese divisions, supported by elements of another division, some 20,000 men in all, had gathered in the hills around Khe Sanh.
In the early hours of January the 21st, North Vietnamese troops attacked an American-held hill just northwest of the base. Then, a few hours later, they launched a major attack on the very heart of the Khe Sanh combat base itself, right here. As the NVA consolidated their positions around the base, the Marines fought back ferociously, but they were surrounded. The NVA had managed to cut off their road link to the outside world. Now, the only way in and out of Khe Sanh was by air.
While the Marines fought hard to stop the North Vietnamese overrunning the vital high ground near the base, General Westmoreland directed more than 24,000 airstrikes against the attackers. He called it Operation Niagara. American aircraft dropped almost 100,000 tons of bombs during the siege. It was an operation that cost $1 billion.
Life for the besieged Marines quickly became a horrific ordeal. The base was shelled constantly. On average, 360 North Vietnamese rounds landed inside the perimeter each day. On the heaviest day of bombardment, 1,300 shells hit US positions.
America's best units and one half of the US Army's mobile reserve in Vietnam were moved up north into the area. As the battle ground on, Johnson threw even more air power into the fight. At Khe Sanh, the Americans dropped around 5 tons of bombs for every one North Vietnamese soldier. But what the Americans and South Vietnamese were about to discover was that when General Giap and Ho Chi Minh came up with their plan, Khe Sanh was not their main target.